Welcome to this explainer. Look, we are going to completely dismantle everything you thought you knew about bouncing back from failure today. For years, we've all been sold this idea that pushing through a setback is just a matter of grinding it out, right? You just grip the steering wheel a little tighter and force yourself to be tougher. Well, today we're unpacking the actual science and psychology behind resilience. And I promise you, the real mechanisms of bouncing back are entirely different from what popular culture has been telling us.
So have you ever noticed that literally everyone fails, but the way we recover is just drastically different? Let's say you set a goal. Maybe you want to work out, start journaling, or eat healthier. You start out incredibly strong. But then, life happens. You miss a day, and suddenly you completely drop the habit. Sometimes you're out by day 3, yet you look around and see other people facing those exact same life interruptions, and they just seem to recover effortlessly. They decide they're going to do something, and they follow through like it's second nature. Why do some people completely spiral while others just keep on going? To figure that out, we have to look at this amazing metaphor from a recent medical paper published in the International Journal for Multidisciplinary Research. It hits the nail on the head. True resilience isn't about being a stiff sword that shatters before a storm. It's about being a supple reed that bends without breaking. It's not about this rigid, macho toughness. It's actually about neuroplasticity. That's your brain's remarkable ability to wire and rewire itself. It's about cognitive reorganization and adaptation. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. We're covering 1, the anatomy of failure. 2, self-compassion beats self-esteem. 3, wiring habits for resilience. 4, achieving post-traumatic growth. And 5, your failure recovery protocol. Let's get right into it.
Section 1, the anatomy of failure, myth versus reality. We absolutely need to start by looking at a major cultural paradigm shift regarding how we process our own setbacks.
For decades, we've been fed the myth of willpower. We are told that overcoming failure means you have to be incredibly hard on yourself. That if you fail, well, you just didn't want it badly enough, and you need to grind through with sheer, exhausting willpower. But the empirical data proves that's just not true. Psychiatrist Dr. Tracy Marks points out that successful habit builders aren't somehow better people, and they definitely don't have stronger willpower. Instead, they rely on the science of automation. They work with their brain's natural tendencies rather than trying to overpower them. Willpower is reactive and finite, but automation, that is proactive and enduring. Moving on to Section 2, self-compassion beats self-esteem. This brings us to how we actually talk to ourselves when we do inevitably fail. We're going to look at some fascinating psychological research led by Yuki Miyagawa on how we treat our own weaknesses.
Now, what is really wild here is the distinct contrast between self-esteem and self-compassion. We usually think highly of self-esteem, right? But the research shows that self-esteem actually makes us defensive. When you have high self-esteem, failure feels like an aversive threat to your self-worth. It's something shameful that you have to avoid at all costs. But self-compassion is an entirely different ballgame. Self-compassion lets us view failure as an adaptive learning opportunity. Because you aren't tying your entire personal worth to the outcome, you suddenly have the emotional stability to look at a failure objectively and just say, okay, how do I grow from this?
This was brilliantly proven in an experiment with over 120 undergrads. Researchers asked them to recall a personal weakness. One group wrote a compassionate message to themselves about it. Another group was told to pump themselves up and focus on their strengths. And a control group was given the surprisingly random task of just listing Japanese prefectures, because, well, why not? The results were totally eye-opening. The group that practiced self-compassion grew more resilient and viewed failure as a chance for growth. But get this, the group that tried to boost their self-esteem by focusing on their strengths actually experienced an increase in harsh self-judgment. It made them view failure as a massive threat. Trying to suppress your weakness by hyper-focusing on your strengths can absolutely backfire.
All right, Section 3, wiring habits for resilience. So the key takeaway here is that once we stop judging ourselves and remove that threat response to failure,
we can actually start rewiring our physical brains.
When you want to bounce back, you have to understand the basal ganglia. Think of this as your brain's autopilot system. Dr. Marks notes that people who bounce back easily have successfully managed to delegate their decisions to this exact region of the brain. They don't have to wake up and consciously drum up the motivation to get back on track after they mess up. Their recovery is already encoded into the basal ganglia, which means it flows with little to literally no conscious effort.
So how do you encode the basal ganglia? You stop relying on willpower and you start relying on environmental design. Look, if you're trying to eat healthier, but your fridge is empty and there's a takeout menu sitting right on the counter, your willpower is going to fail, for sure. But environmental design, like prepping your meals on Sunday, or setting your workout clothes out the night before, or just leaving your journal right on your pillow, that makes the desired behavior the path of least resistance. You are literally placing physical cues in your path to nudge your brain in the right direction. And this perfectly illustrates the absolute power of identity in habit formation. People who bounce back tell themselves a totally different story. If you say, I am trying to write every day, you're framing the habit as an external task. It's a chore. But if you say, I am a writer, you tap into your identity. When your behavior aligns with your self-image, your prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, actually works harder to protect and maintain that habit. You aren't just doing a task anymore, you are being who you are. Section 4. Achieving post-traumatic growth. Let's zoom out from our daily habits for a second and see how these exact same concepts apply to massive, life-altering crises. What happens when life just completely shatters? According to research from the International Journal for Multidisciplinary Research, when individuals face severe health emergencies or physical traumas, resilience is not just the absence of sorrow or fear. It is the active, deliberate reorganization of your cognition. Just like rewiring a daily habit, dealing with trauma requires a psychological reorganization to restore your belief in your own self-efficacy. It is taking that supple read concept we talked about to its absolute limit, shifting from passive survival to active positive adjustment, which ultimately leads to what psychologists call post-traumatic growth. Finally, Section 5, your failure recovery protocol. Time to take all this neurobiology, psychology, and academic research and turn it into a practical, everyday toolkit for you to use right now. This is called if-then planning, and it's basically the foundation of bouncing back. Vague goals fail. You need clarity. If-then planning gives your brain a specific cue and a specific behavior to shift you from a reactive state to a proactive state. For example, if I miss my morning meditation, then I will do a 1-minute breathing exercise at my desk. You are deciding in advance what you will do when, not if, you slip up. It gives your brain the exact clarity it needs to encode that basal ganglia we were talking about earlier. And we can pull directly from the playbooks of highly successful entrepreneurs to round out your personal failure recovery protocol. When a business venture fails, the best founders out there don't beat themselves up. They reframe failure as feedback. They analyze the root causes without that harsh self-judgment. They seek guidance. They break complex challenges down into iterative experiments, and they celebrate the tiny wins to build momentum back up. They know that a missed day or a failed launch isn't the end of the process. It literally is the process. Which brings us to the ultimate question. The next time you fail, whether that's breaking a 3-day streak on a new habit, facing a setback at work, or navigating a massive life crisis, how are you going to respond? Will you be the stiff sword, relying on exhausting willpower and harsh self-judgment until you finally shatter? Or will you be the supple reed? I want to leave you with this to challenge your identity. Ask yourself right now how you will design your environment, practice self-compassion, and program your mind to bend, learn, and grow when the storm hits. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.